Welcome, everyone. So glad that you guys could attend today. We're looking forward to having Dr. Jenna Kirchner present. I know you've probably heard her before. She is one of our regular webinar presenters and also one of our certified facilitators for Active Classroom. So it's always a pleasure to have Dr. Jenna Kirchner with us. Today, she's going to be talking about how we can increase rigor in the classroom using Active Classroom. And we're just going to turn it over to her. So, Jana, thank you for being here, and it's all yours.
Thanks, Pam, and hello, everybody. I'm glad you chose to join us at this busy time of year. I'm excited to be with you and talk about how we can use Active Classroom resources to increase rigor in your classroom. Let me give you just a brief little background on me. I'm a former high school social studies and English teacher, and also worked teaching social studies methods at the university, and recently retired as an instructional supervisor for a school district. So I'm really enjoying being a part-time contract worker now for social studies school service. So that's my background, and you'll see some of that come out in some of the examples that we use throughout the webinar. Just to remind you, there is a chat feature in this system, and if you would, a couple of times throughout the presentation, if you will type your comments and get some responses, and I'll give you some time to do that. And also just to let you know that I have a lot of screenshots from Active Classroom in this, and so we'll do that, use those instead of using Active Classroom live features for the purposes of this webinar. So to get us started, we're going to talk about tonight, what is rigor and what does it look like in the classroom? And then also, how can we use Active Classroom resources to increase the level of rigor in your lessons? As we do that, we'll look at some background on what rigor is, how we measure that, and then specifically we'll showcase some Active Classroom series that can help you build the rigor in your lessons. So all that'll be embedded in what we do tonight. To get us started, I want you to use the chat feature and think about how to answer this prompt. Thinking of your classroom, rigorous lessons in a social studies classroom require students to. I'm going to be quiet for just a minute and let you give some feedback on that. So one example is having students to research the northern, middle, or southern colonies, teaching about colonial America, and having them debate and present their colony and why it was the best place for settlers to go. So absolutely, that's a great example that they would have to look up the information, they would have to present it, and try to argue their cause. It's a great example. Another example is a classroom discussion on civil rights, and have civil rights been achieved in the United States today? That's a wonderful, rigorous, high-level question, and students could argue that using a variety of sources and points of view. It's a great example of a rigorous task. If you notice, both of those examples had students looking at sources, had students discussing with each other, communicating their findings, backing up their point of view with evidence. And those are things we're going to talk about as we look at what rigor looks like in social studies. Great responses. So what is rigor? These are a couple of my favorite quotes that I found that I think have some ideas in it we want to build off of. Rigor doesn't simply mean giving students more or harder work. Instead, it's the result of work that challenges students' thinking in new and interesting ways. And I like that idea of how are we challenging students' thinking? And the second quote, and you can see the sources there for those, rigor means that students are challenged to think, perform, and grow to a level that they were not at previously. It means that students must work like an athlete at a team practice to build their skills, understanding, and thinking power so that they can achieve at higher and higher levels. I love the ideas in there of practicing. It takes practice building skills. If you think of something in your own personal life that you didn't know how to do, something that challenged you, think about how you had to practice it. Maybe somebody showed you how to do it and modeled it, and you practiced and practiced until you got better at that skill. That's exactly what we want as students develop their skills in our classrooms. That's what we want to encourage. So rigor over the years has been discussed through a variety of lenses, and one of those that we all know is Bloom, and this is Bloom's revised taxonomy. And for the most part, we would probably say that rigor is anything from apply, analyze, evaluate, create, those top levels. If you notice, evaluate, there are some of the descriptors in that. Students can appraise, defend, support, select, critique, or they can compare and contrast. That's kind of how we would define rigor using Bloom. A more recent way of talking about rigor is using Norman Webb's depth of knowledge levels. And if you are not familiar with those, you can see many examples of those online, but those are organized into DOK levels 1 through 4. DOK level 1 is knowledge recall, very similar to the lower level of Bloom's. But if you notice, as you get to DOK 2 and DOK 3 levels, DOK 2 students are required to answer questions, address problems, analyze text. Those are some social studies language words in there. DOK 3, they have to think about how and why concepts, ideas, and operations can help explain answers, draw conclusions, make decisions. Those are what we want to try to target as we talk about rigor in our classroom. How can we get lessons and get students thinking to a DOK 2 or 3 level? DOK 4 happens to be more extended learning, where they may research, do presentations, present to a real-world audience. That's a little more challenging to do and takes a little bit more time. So we're going to really focus on DOK 2 and 3 examples. I really like the quote at the bottom, and this is from Norman Webb's work, that the more complex the task, the more higher order thinking skills it requires of students. And specifically this next sentence, the more cognitive steps or processes a student is required to use to provide an answer, the greater the depth of knowledge. So what does that mean? So if we have two sources that students are looking at, they might have to read the first one and figure out the main ideas and point of view, and then read the second one and figure out the main ideas and point of view of the author, and then compare and contrast those two sources on an issue. Those are multiple cognitive steps that a student will have to do, so that ups the DOK level and ups the level of rigor. Even more recent way of us thinking in social studies about rigor and what are those thinking skills we want students to tackle in social studies is the college career and civic life framework and what is called the inquiry arc in that framework. And if you notice, it is divided into 4 dimensions. So we want students developing questions and planning inquiries. We want students applying their disciplinary skills, so reading like a historian, looking at charts and analyzing data like an economist. Specifically, for the rest of the webinar tonight, we're going to focus on dimensions 3 and a little bit of dimension 4, evaluating sources and using evidence. And developing claims and using evidence is a part of that. And then communicating conclusions and taking action. So how do students explain what they've learned with evidence-based examples? So we're going to use that as the frame, either Bloom or DOK or specifically C3, as we look at some good practice tips for increasing rigor using active classroom resources. So here are 4 big ideas that we're going to focus on for the rest of the webinar, and there are 4 ways to increase the rigor in your classroom. One of those is design lessons that center around essential questions. Plan lessons to include high-level questioning by both teacher and students. Questions like how or why, or specifically what evidence can you use to back that up. The third one is allow students to actively construct meaning from primary and secondary sources to answer a question. And lastly, require students to explain and to justify their thinking with evidence using specific academic vocabulary. Those are challenging tasks, and we know that students sometimes have some barriers to learning that make that difficult. But I want to highlight some active classroom series that help build in some of that work for you and help automatically have students doing rigorous tasks. So we're going to look at a few series as we take each of those good practice ideas kind of one at a time. And if you will notice in the top left-hand corner, I have circled what the series is, if you're interested in that or looking that up, again, and exploring all the different lessons under that series. But the first one we're going to talk about is C3 inquiry. And our big idea is designing lessons that center around essential questions. This particular lesson that I screenshotted is the Louisiana Purchase. And notice the question, was it a good bargain? So everything in this lesson is designed to help students answer that question with evidence from sources. If you notice also on the left-hand side of what comes up in Active Classroom, you'll see there's a teacher's guide. For most of the series I'm going to show you, there's strategies for helping students analyze primary sources. Sometimes, like we talked about at the beginning, you just need to practice those skills and keep practicing them to get better at it. So if you notice also in this series, there are a variety of primary sources. They have 10 in each lesson. You may decide you want to use all 10. You may decide just to pick a few of those. You get to be the boss of that. But notice that they have a little background and then they give you the original primary source. Also included in this C3 series, because it's focusing on those dimensions we talked about, are some strategies for helping students communicate results and taking action. So this is what that looks like as you click on that particular box right there. And I circled some of the things that I wanted you to look at that are right out of our examples of what rigorous social studies lessons look like. You also have choices as a teacher always, so you can pick and choose what works best to fit your state standards or your students' interests or ability levels. But notice some of the ways that they can communicate results at the end of this lesson where they've studied primary sources is they might go look for other journal entries. Remember, this is about Lewis and Clark and the Louisiana Purchase. And notice the task here. Look for entries that provide insight into the value of this territory to the United States, as well as entries that suggest problems that the territory could present. So notice they are doing research with a guided task, and as they choose those entries, they have to explain why they selected them. So that's them explaining their thinking with examples. There are prompts about taking notes, comparing and contrasting, writing a letter where you show examples of the content that you learned, conducting a panel discussion. So in the C3 series, you'll see there are a variety of options that you can build in as an assessment or a task to help students communicate their results. Our second good practice idea is to plan lessons to include high-level questioning by both teacher and students. So sometimes we're good as teachers at us asking the high-level questions, but we also want to challenge students, especially as we think about what inquiry looks like and sounds like. We want to challenge those students to ask some of their own questions. So one way to do this is to use paintings or visuals or political cartoons to sort of pique their interest and build some background knowledge before you start your lesson. And this particular one is John Gass' American Progress, and it comes from the series History Unfolding. And you will see that series in Active Classroom is designed around using visuals. But this one particularly has a question: manifest destiny, ideal, or justification? Well, we're going to assume the students don't know anything about that, and we're going to start using this American Progress image to help them start to develop some of their own questions. One of my favorite strategies to do that is I notice and I wonder, and you may be familiar with this, or a version of it is also called I see, I think, I wonder. And you put up a visual, or you could use a movie clip or any type of painting, political cartoon, and you have students just in this left-hand column do a very literal description of what they see or what they notice. So for our American Progress, they may notice, I'm going to flip back for just a second. They may notice a lady. They may or may not know what the lady's supposed to represent, and wagons and Native Americans, and there's a stagecoach, and there's some farmers. You train them, and again, practicing that skill, you train them to do very literal description of what they notice in the particular visual. Then the second column on the right-hand side is I wonder, and in this column, they generate their own questions. So they could do this individually or they could do this with a partner, but they generate questions about what they notice in this particular visual. Some of the questions I've done this with students and teachers at all grade levels, they will say, who's the lady? Why is she pulling that wire? How come it's light on the right side and dark on the left side? Is she chasing people out? Where are those people going? Where are they coming from? Those are the kind of questions that even elementary students at that level will generate. Why are there ships in the back and it looks like buffalo? They'll come up with all kinds of questions, and you let those guide what you do next in your lesson. So it's rigorous as students are creating their own questions, and then you as a teacher providing them ways to answer those. So just real quickly, if you haven't used the image examiner tools in Active Classroom, just notice that those are there on the bottom right-hand corner. And as you click on those, you can enlarge an image to full screen. You can do picture quadrants. There's a magnifying glass, and you can kind of zoom in on any of the areas. So students love doing that if you choose to use this digitally. Also, as with everything in Active Classroom, you can use this as a one teacher showing this on your screen and everybody doing it together. The same with all the sources. You can assign them digitally, or you can print those out and students would write on them. Either way works in Active Classroom. You notice the series, History Unfolding. Notice that it has different illustrations. It gives a little introduction, background, teacher's guide, and overview for you how to use it. So students could use the image examiner tools. This is an example of the picture quadrant. So you would click on this image and it enlarges it so students can see more detail, which is great for any kind of image that you can use that has a lot of pieces and parts in it. Makes a lot more detailed questions that the students can generate. So then they have their list of I wonder questions. Then you can assign a text that they are going to read with the purpose of answering questions that they generated themselves. So I just picked one, Power Basics. Is it usually for struggling readers or English language learners, but I just use this as an example in this one. This is a text on westward expansion, and they're going to read it and highlight it and annotate it to answer their own questions. So it's student-generated questions that they're going to answer by examining this particular one. Happens to be a secondary source. But to show you what that looks like, if you do it in Active Classroom, you can customize the assignment, and that's what I did with this example, to show what you want the students to do. Like, I want them to read this text, and I want them to highlight in green any answers they can find to their I wonder questions that they generated, and then highlight in blue anything that they just think is an interesting fact that might help us answer our question. They can also add annotations. And if you notice, this is what a student screen would look like. So here are the green and the blue highlights doing the I notice, I wonder, and the interesting facts. They can also click on it and add an annotation in a way of what they were thinking about that, and the teacher can also reply back to them and have that dialogue about what they're thinking. Again, you can print this reading out and give students a highlighter and do exactly the same thing. But the key is they're looking for answers from a text to answer their own questions. So that was History Unfolding. Another series, I gotta confess, one of my favorites is decision making. And decision making lessons are designed around a big idea question. So this one happens to be world history, and this is where would you settle in ancient times? And if you notice, just like many other series in Active Classroom, there's a teacher's guide. The student handouts can be downloaded as PDFs. There's examples for how to implement this with students. And then if you will notice, there is a list of vocabulary. There are leveled readers here, so you could decide how to differentiate this based on your students. So it's same content, but there's a level 1 and a level 2. And then most include primary sources. So if you wanted to add the Code of Hammurabi in there, you could. So let me tell you how this lesson setup works, or this series setup works, and you'll see how rigorous it is. In this particular lesson, students are given 3 different societies. So the readings are about Society A, Society B, and Society C. You could put them in groups if you want by societies. You could individually have them read and annotate. There are a variety of ways to implement that. But the gist of it is students read about their society, and they're looking for clues to figure out where it is. We don't know yet where society A, B, or C are located, but where is the society and reasons that you might want to settle in that society. So everything ties back to our question, where would you settle in ancient times? So here's just a screenshot of society A and society B. And here's how it works at the end. And I've seen teachers do this where each group shares their society with another, where you sort of jigsaw this, or you have society A present their place, society B present their place, and so on. And the thinking in this at the end is, in which society would you choose to live? And you have to choose, but you have to give reasons for your choice. So you are using examples from those readings to answer that big idea question. Where would you settle in ancient times? And that can be used a variety of different ways. You find out at the end that those places are Egypt, Mesopotamia, and a nomadic culture. But students have to defend why they picked that place to settle. So it's great, rigorous thinking there. Another best practice idea as far as developing rigor in your classroom is to allow students to actively construct meaning, in other words, build their own knowledge from primary and secondary sources to answer a question. So we've talked about a little already, answering questions and organizing lessons around essential questions. But notice the parts of this. Students are going to build their own meaning from both primary and secondary sources. And we know that's good social studies practice, and that is in the literacy standards as well. So let's look at the series that's called The Historian's Apprentice. This Historian's Apprentice includes a variety of primary sources and secondary sources. It includes a warm-up activity where students relate the topic to their background and their personal lives. And it also focuses on 5 habits of historical thinking. So in each of these lessons, there's some background as what is it like to read like a historian? How do we analyze sources? There are resources in there to help you as a teacher teach students to interpret primary sources and how to read secondary sources. And you'll see those on the left-hand side as I do some of these screenshots. This is an example of the PowerPoint. Just I want to show you a couple of slides, how you can teach and model for students what historical thinking is all about. So it could be cause and effect. It could be, I really like the detective model, where you have a problem, you look for evidence, and you interpret that evidence. And those are all built into these historian apprentices lessons. So like a detective, a historian sets out to solve a key problem or answer a major question. And again, these are slides that I pulled out of the PowerPoint that comes with the lesson, so you have access to all of these. So we're going to be looking at what purpose or set of purposes was Ellis Island supposed to serve. So you have included in this lesson a variety of primary sources. Again, as a teacher, you can pick and choose if you want to use them all or if you want just to use a few, maybe that have competing points of view. But you also get some background. This is the primary sources checklist that can also be downloaded as a PDF, a one-page handout for you to give students, just as a reminder of what it means to analyze primary sources. There are also secondary sources then that are included. It was some background information on how to analyze secondary sources. And if this is new to your students, I would really stress to you as a teacher to model your thinking. Take a primary source. Before you make an assignment, take a primary source from the list here and put it up there, and you break it down together. You do think aloud, you highlight important words, you show students what you do as a teacher as you're trying to analyze a source. Because remember, we're trying to build those skills, and building to rigor means building the skills to get there and providing some supports and scaffolds to do that. So if you haven't used primary sources much in your classroom, please model and show them how to do it before you make these types of assignments. If you notice at the end, also in Historian's Apprentice, it gives you some options for assessment at the end of this lesson. If you remember, our lesson was about Ellis Island. And there are examples of document-based questions or DBQs that you can use. This particular one has 4 sources. You could use that as a whole class essay. You could have each divide into groups and have each group provide an answer to that. But the key is they've got to use evidence. They're building their own meaning using evidence from the primary and secondary sources. You may also choose to have it as a class debate, and there are instructions provided for how to schedule and structure a debate for students, and that might be something you want to do instead, or a little bit of both. So lots of options built into this Historian Apprentice series. And our last big idea point is that, and these overlap a little bit, but we want to require students to explain and to justify their thinking with evidence using specific academic vocabulary. And I'm going to show you 3 different series in Active Classroom. And one, I wanted to just show you a simple way to do it and show you a video, in that most of the videos in Active Classroom require just that. Students have to explain and justify their thinking with evidence. This particular one I just pulled out is on the atomic bomb, and notice the questions. What's the main idea of this video? And then 3 details that support this idea. So as you assign students to watch that, or as you watch it as a whole class, you can cue them to, these are our look for and our listen for. So we're going to have to figure out the main idea, but what are those details that support it? So that could be a short assignment, short time task. A little bit longer lesson that is a wonderful series in Active Classroom is History's Mysteries. And the one I pulled was the Black Death, to show you what this series looks like. If you haven't seen this one, this is one students tend to love because they are thinking like a criminalist or a detective, and most have seen detective shows on TV. Before we start, notice all the resources that come with it. Teacher's guide on ways to implement it. The PowerPoint with some of the slides you're going to see that I've put into this one. Press release that gives them the facts at the end. Some background reading, directions, and a variety of assessments I'll show you at the end. So in History's Mysteries, you have a big idea question. For the Black Death, this one particular one is, how did the bubonic plague change life in Europe during the 1300s? So that's the focus. They're going to work as if they are a criminalist or a detective, and you can set this up in a variety of fun ways. And they're going to have to look at the evidence. And notice these words here. These are all out of our rigor descriptors at the very beginning. Gathering evidence, analyzing evidence, interpreting evidence to make a decision or answer a problem. These are PowerPoint slides that are included in that series, so you have access to all of them. The students will get a forensic report and work with their team to look at clues that are organized into the crime scene, the coroner's report, and then detective's research, which is a variety of notes that give students the background in those areas. They have a forensic report clue sheet that they will take notes on the things that they're seeing. It works great in a gallery walk kind of setting where they go around the room and they look at all the clues. Here's some examples of what those look like from this particular lesson. So you see the coroner's report there. You're going to find out that this is someone who died during the plague. So all this is provided with the lesson. This is one example of one of the slides that go with the detective's research. So you'll see some pictures and you'll see some content that's already put together for the students. So they are writing that on their forensic analysis sheet. And then they have to decide what happened, why did it happen, what was the crime, who was guilty, and then specifically use that to answer the big idea question. There are a variety of assessment options built into these lessons, and students might just decide to, you might give them choice on what they want to do with this. They could have a text message that summarizes their findings, or a news story, or a news report. Maybe they want to do a skit, or a graphic organizer where they decide the criminalist theory on that. So you can give them choices, or you may just want to pick and choose one that everybody does. So notice this whole lesson is a little bit longer way of having students explain and justify their thinking. They will have academic vocabulary because that's built into those clues that they're looking at. And one more series that I really like how it requires students to justify their thinking is the Debating the Document series. This particular Debating the Documents is called From God Kings to World Religions. And again, just to show you some of the things that come with it, it always has suggestions for implementing a teacher's guide at the top, an intro essay, so you and the students will have some background information. This one has a timeline, and I think that's helpful sometimes as students try to understand chronological order. But notice it has visual primary sources, and they compare the documents and they decide which one they like and why. Let me show you what that looks like. So for this particular one, God Kings to World Religions, you'll see visual sources included and comparing the documents in SAPs, and then written sources and comparing the documents in SAPs. So if we know our question and we look at written sources, here's what comes at the end of the comparing the documents. And as I highlight some of this, think about the historical thinking that's in this. So students have to, for the written piece of this, look at documents 1 through 5. And if you notice, documents 1 and 2 are grouped together, documents 3 through 5 are grouped together. They have to decide which of these primary source documents would be most useful to a historian trying to understand the rise of world religions in the first millennium BCE. Okay, so you've got to read and understand the documents, and you might do that with a partner. You might annotate, you might figure out point of view. So you're reading and understanding each document, and then you're making a decision. I think these documents are better for a historian because you have to justify your thinking. I did not choose these documents because, but then notice the second sentence here. However, a historian still might use the documents in the following way. So notice the multiple levels of cognitive processing we have there. To go back to our depth of knowledge, first they have to read and figure out what the documents mean. Then they have to figure out which one would be most useful to a historian and why it would be useful. But another way of processing is, okay, I didn't choose these sources, but a historian could use those in a variety of ways. So the level of rigor in that particular task has multiple cognitive steps that students are having to process. So we have quickly gone through C3 inquiry, history unfolding, decision making, the historian's apprentice, history's mysteries, and debating the documents. You saw one example of those. How do you find these? How do I figure out what other lessons are in those series? If Active Classroom is new to you, let me just show you how to do that. In Active Classroom, you search under Activities, and you will get a screen that looks like this, and an advanced search menu is here. You can also just type in words there, but sometimes it's easier to use the advanced search menu, and you can search by subjects, era or theme, series title, or activity types. Let me show you what that looks like. If we clicked on series title, it will have a drop-down menu that shows all the series in Active Classroom. If you really like those history mysteries, or you really like that C3 inquiry lesson, or Historian's Apprentice, you can search just by that particular series, and it will show you all the ones that Active Classroom has built in. So you can figure out one that matches your content and your standards for your class. You can also search a type activity. I really like this one too. So you just want a video, that's that very last box on the advanced search menu, or you want a decision-making activity, or you want a reading, you can search by that and it will filter through that as well. And as always, as you're using Active Classroom, there are a variety of ways to get help. If you need help, there's a question mark at the top that will help provide you help if you need it. A contact us button that will have a variety of video tutorials are provided on there, and you'll get immediate response back if you choose to hit that question or the contact us button, either one. So questions or comments about anything we talked about?
Jana, I love this. This is great. I'm just so excited about everything that you've been showing us here. And wow, I bet everybody listening today is eager now to dive into some of these particular titles that you showed us, and showed us how to get and see the rigor that is embedded in those. Thank you so much. This was fabulous today.
Thanks, Pam.
Okay, everyone. Well, we're so glad you could join in. If you've got a test, if you have a question or a comment, please go ahead and send that to Jana now, and she will be glad to answer those for you.
And Pam, Jana, I don't mind sharing this PowerPoint. I put my email there. If anybody's interested in that, I'll be glad to share.
Oh, I can imagine some people would love to share that with their departments. That would be a great idea. So guys, if y'all want to get this and use her PowerPoint to share with your department to talk about rigor, go for it. We'll be delighted for you to do that. Jana, thank you for making that available to people. That is awesome.
No problem. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you everybody for attending today. We're delighted you were here, and we look forward to you joining us in the near future for another of our great webinars. Have a great afternoon. Thank you.